So I kept thinking of different things that maybe to share, thinking about especially it being Father's Day. And fatherhood is all throughout the Scripture. The theme of God being our Father and the relationship, particularly between fathers and sons. I think it was last Sunday that Mr. Frierson talked about one of the most famous father-son stories from the book of Genesis, as God asked Abraham to take his son, his only son, which was in itself an interesting thing because he did have one other son, but the child of promise, God asked to take him up onto Mount Moriah to offer him as a burnt sacrifice before the Lord. And we talked about how Abraham had such faith and such confidence in God that he would raise his son from the dead if he was going to do something, because he knew that God had promised that it would be through Isaac that the promise would be fulfilled. And in that story, we see the picture of God giving us his own son and providing him for our atonement. So I thought about that story. I also thought about one of the famous stories from the New Testament, father-son story. Who thinks maybe what's one of the most famous father-son stories in the New Testament? Anybody got any ideas? The prodigal son, right. Yeah, was that what you guys are going to say? Yeah, okay. Right, the prodigal son. Actually, you could say the prodigal sons. There are two sons in that story, right? But we do remember the first one, the story of a young man who did not really appreciate all that he had, all he had been given, and demanded his inheritance, and went out, and the scripture says, wasted it on, I think the King James says, riotous living. And eventually, hard times came, and he lost everything that he had. And children, do you remember what happened to that young man? Where did he end up? Yeah, Elizabeth? In a pig pen. That's right. My kids made me pig's feet this morning for breakfast. Don't worry, it's not what you think it is. My wife told me, though, that she couldn't find, this is a recipe that no one else knows about, because she couldn't even find a recipe for it. She went off of what she remembered a family friend teaching them long ago. So that's why none of you had pig's feet this morning for breakfast. But yes, Elizabeth, he ended up in a pig pen. And what did he say when he was in the pig pen? Who remembers? What did he say? Yes, Benjamin?
He said he was better to be a servant because his father's servants had food.
Right, he said, right, my father's slaves eat better than this. So he decided that he would go back to his father and say, Dad, I really blew it. Would you take me back as your servant? And who remembers what happened? How about someone else? I know you know, Elizabeth. Anybody else? What did the father do? Did he see his son afar off and say, wow, it's about time. About time you showed up. Yeah, not even that. He'd been waiting, hadn't he? He'd been looking every day. Is it today? And my son's going to come back. He expected to see his son again, and when he saw his son, he didn't even wait for him to get to the driveway. He ran while his son was still afar off. He ran and he embraced him and kissed him, and he gave him his robe and gave him a ring, and they had a big barbecue. Right? Now, the funny thing about that story is a lot of people forget, they think that's where it ends. One big happy woohoo! But who remembers the other prodigal son? Okay, some other than that row. Oh, maybe we'll come back to that row. Who was not happy at all this events? The older brother. He was not happy. And Elizabeth, why was the older brother not happy?
Because the dad replied to the son, and he looked for dad, and he said to himself, I shouldn't have gone hard. I was with my dad. I'd rather let him spend all his money.
So, and what did his dad say to him? Quit your whining and get back to work.
Or you take up to the party.
No. His dad treated him with as much grace as his younger brother. Said, your brother's been lost. Now he's found. He's back home. He didn't chastise him for his ungratefulness. Do you understand, children, that the older brother had the exact same problem as the younger brother? He just said it differently. Older brother wasn't any more thankful for his upbringing, for anything his dad was doing, than his younger brother. Because it was all about me, me, me. Look at everything I've done for you, Dad. Aren't you glad I'm on your team? Not like that low-life scoundrel who took off all those years ago. Jesus was making a point, because there were plenty of people who were listening to him who thought that God was their father and was happy to have them as his sons. We're the chosen people. We're the Pharisees, man. We got it all together. So all these other sinners out here, they don't know what they're doing. And it was the same problem, right? Both sons needed grace, needed God's mercy, needed to understand that without him they weren't anything. And yet we see the Father extend that grace to both sons. I wish we knew the end of the story. I'd like to think that the older son heart was touched and he realized his own spirit of ungratefulness and unbelief and entered into the celebration as much for him as for his brother. We don't know. Jesus didn't tell us the rest of the story. But that's a story of fathers and sons, so I thought about that. And then I thought about probably one of the most famous verses in the Bible about a father and a son. You all know it. John 3:16. For God, say it with me, for God so loved the world that he gave us his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. The Father who gives his Son so that we all might become sons of God. So there's a lot about fathers and sons in the Scripture. Probably one of my favorite passages is what we'll talk about just a little bit here. We'll read it in Romans 8. Romans 8 verses 12 through 17. Therefore, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption, by whom we cry out. Everybody cry out, Abba, Father. It's like Papa or Daddy. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. If indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. So the question I have for you this morning, children and moms and dads, who's your daddy? Who's your daddy? Children, you know who your daddy is? Not the daddy who's sitting with you here today, or maybe not here, but somewhere else. But who is your father? Is God your father? Dr. Summers has spoken on this many times. You know, there's only two options on the table. You're either a son of God or you're a son of Satan. There's not any other option. And Jesus made that quite clear to the Pharisees and those who criticized him, those who would not believe. They said, Abraham is our father. He said, no, Abraham's not your father. Your father is a father of lies. So, today is a great day. I can't think of any other better day than on Father's Day to accept the invitation of that dad who's waiting for you at the end of the driveway, as it were, in the prodigal son story, who's waiting. He's waiting. He's waiting. God is waiting. He's given the invitation. He's got the feast ready for you. But you still have to come home. Or you need to believe. Maybe you think you're home. Don't think, we can't say this enough. I don't think we can't say this enough. Just because you're in a Christian home, just because you're in a homeschool program, just because you're in a Christian conservative church or whatever, you put the label on. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. Because none of those people are your daddy. God the Father is who you have to be reconciled with to become a son of God or daughter of God. So children, please, and moms and dads, if you've not gotten that straight, there's no better day than today to put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, the Son that God sent, that the Father sent, so that we can become children of God. And that's why we have the Lord's table. That's why we have communion, so we can remember, so we have an opportunity every time we take it, every time we have it, to remember what God has done. And if you have not accepted that, it's an opportunity to do so. So let's have, we can have two men come forward.